Mother Rakella embarked on a secret project. She wanted to breed better leaders.
One of the most terrifying things about Dune is the fact that it rather accurately predicted what the next front of warfare will look like: genetic warfare. In 2025, gene manipulation is the biggest threat in the theater of war because one gene-altering weapon can render an enemy force infertile at best and terribly mutated at worst. But that's not something that happens to the products of breeding programs in the Dune-verse, at least on a physical level. In this video, we'll take a look at every breeding program in Frank Herbert's creation and talk about their horrifying histories in detail. Before we get into our explanation, though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Bene Gesserit Kwisatz Haderach Breeding Program. The main breeding program from the Dune-verse, the one that everyone knows about, is the Kwisatz Haderach program. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood began this secret project several centuries before the main timeline of Dune. By crossing the bloodlines of noble houses and incubating them within the wombs of sisters, they hoped to produce a super being who would be akin to the god of this new universe. For 90 generations, they deceived those they claimed to serve, stealing genes from their family trees and creating the matrix required for the birth of the Kwisatz. Every child born from this program was a woman up until Paul was conceived, because in the Bene Gesserit's master plan for the universe, eugenics takes the top spot. Now, the field of eugenics is one of the most controversial in the world, partially because it was one that was popular until fairly recently. Even today, the notion of genetic superiority is often underlined by racial tones, but back in the late 19th century, there was nothing subtle about it. Eugenics was clearly an attempt to, quote-unquote, prove the existence of a master race from a scientific perspective, combining a wide array of fields like anthropology and genetics into a single discipline. Frank Herbert might not have been a proponent of the theory, but he certainly used it quite heavily to explain the more mystical elements of his series. The Kwisatz Haderach program represents the pinnacle of eugenic thought. Over 90 generations, the sisterhood collected countless DNA samples from the noble houses of the Landsraad and dominated politics by becoming advisors, concubines, even ladies and queens on occasion. The Bene Gesserit represent the pinnacle of eugenics in a way. They are the ideal women, capable of controlling their cellular biology to such an extent that they will never age should they desire so. They can even determine the sex of their child, and we don't mean determine in the sense they can guess whether it'll be a boy or a girl. The Bene Gesserit control the sex of their babies, which is how they've stumped several noble houses from advancing their cause. The most glaring example of this is Emperor Shaddam Corrino only having daughters as heirs. Shaddam married a Bene Gesserit sister and had 4 girls by her. His eldest and designated heir, Irulan, is a Bene Gesserit sister herself, but the fact that she is a woman is a major impediment to her assuming power. Despite all the trappings of a feminist society, Dune remains firmly grounded in patriarchy, and that's displayed by the fact that the end product of the Kwisatz Haderach program was supposed to be male. Through this male, the sisters hope to control the universe and the fate of all men, guiding them into an endless golden age, and if that doesn't sound like a eugenic dream quest, then we don't know what does. Of course, Herbert didn't exactly endorse this practice in his early books. In fact, the existence of Paul goes against the idea of creating the perfect being. Paul Atreides was born a generation before he was supposed to be, and not under the watchful eye of the sisterhood. He was taught all of their skills, but none of their propaganda, and propaganda is a key tool of the Bene Gesserit. They've used propaganda to wage psychological warfare on their enemies for years, and they've made themselves indispensable through it. The Bene Gesserit claim to be a priestly organization, but in the secrecy of the mother schools, they harshly reject religion and all its lies. Paul, if he had been born according to their plan, would have been inundated with their ideology by the time he became a young adult. But because he wasn't, their eugenics quest failed in achieving its most crucial goal, placing the Kwisatz Haderach under their authority. Many people think that the Bene Gesserit goal of producing the Kwisatz was more important to them than retaining control of him, and this is just not the case. Controlling the Kwisatz was their top priority and had been for centuries, and according to Dune prophecy, Desmond Miles is the reason why. This Atreides Harkonnen bastard somehow possesses prescience, and in the cinematic Dune-verse, he's the template for the final goal of the Kwisatz program. He inspires the idea that the Kwisatz should be born of an Atreides and a Harkonnen because he himself exhibits awesome powers, and there are several hints in Season 1 that Valia Harkonnen, the current Mother Superior, has picked up on this. Gaius Helen Mohayim, in her arrogance or ignorance, decided to let the Lady Jessica look after her mistake in private, and that was her biggest mistake in turn. Jessica didn't raise Paul to be loyal to the Sisterhood, she raised him to be loyal to House Atreides, and that's why Paul accepts his role as the Fremen Mahdi. In the end, his claiming of the powers and mantle of the Kwisatz Haderach is motivated by a desire for blood, not progress. In the end, the mind of one individual undoes years of careful planning and secrecy, and that's the problem with breeding programs. You can control all the psychological factors down to the last detail, but you can never ensure full psychological subordination. The creation of a super being, by definition, makes you inferior to it in every aspect, and if you fail to train God to obey you, physical strength won't help you out one bit. The Bene Gesserit learn their lesson and never try to create another Kwisatz Haderach, but they don't exactly stop their breeding program either. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but here's what makes the Kwisatz Haderach breeding program so disgusting. It assumes that it can restructure the foundations of mankind and get away with it clean. Like we mentioned at the beginning of this video, genetic manipulation represents the highest frontier of biochemical warfare. A weapon that can alter your gene code is far more dangerous than a bullet or even a strong chemical gas, because it fundamentally alters your existence. The Sisterhood tried to create an organic weapon of mass destruction, and they chose the worst possible attributes of the human psyche to do it. You'd think that an order that is supposedly dedicated to God would espouse chastity, but the Sisters use every seductive move in the playbook to secure genes and important alliances. In fact, they've perfected the art of sex to the point that they can emotionally enslave men to their will, though it isn't so complete as them being shackled and manacled. It's said that when a Bene Gesserit sister imprints on a male, the reaction in their body is so strong that they instantly fall in love with them and stay that way for the rest of their lives, no matter how many other women or wives they take on. This bond can be broken through in a way in that the enslaved can choose to commit suicide, like Emperor Javico did towards the end of Dune Prophecy Season 1. But if suicide's your best way out of this, then you know it's downright evil. This isn't even mentioning the fact that they were going to use worse techniques to bind Paul to their will. Many of the Sisterhood's inductees are taken at an extremely early age or from homeless backgrounds. This allows them to fully indoctrinate these girls so that once they're ready to go back out into society, they don't even think about betraying the great purpose. Paul Atreides' victory over Gaius Helen Mohayim feels like a triumph when you look at it from the perspective of morality, because of course, the gene-manipulating old witch is the evil one in this case. But from a eugenic standpoint, he was a complete success, at least on a physiological level. Paul did gain access to the male half of other memory that's blocked for the Bene Gesserit, and he did gain the power to guide the universe on a golden path. However, this is where his personal nature and human individualism won out over the desire to force collective evolution. Paul focused his efforts towards liberating the Fremen and becoming their Mahdi instead of being the universe's savior because he desired vengeance for his father, or House Atreides. In the novels, at least, he's near constantly crippled by his terrible purpose, and when he makes the call to assume leadership of the Fremen, it's one made with a great deal of pain. But in the movies, Paul walks in like a badass, convinces himself he needs to win this war as a Harkonnen, and proceeds to brutally enforce his rule over the Imperium. His last line in the film is "lead them to paradise," which stands in stark contrast with the closing sentiment of the novels, where the fighters were the focus of the Fremen's freedom movement. Paul was still an outsider, but his integration into their culture was more complete, and so at least it didn't feel too weird that him and his children ended up being the last true Fremen. But even then, the fact that they exist in the first place is an abomination. The Bene Gesserit made the Imperium shun the Tleilaxu precisely because they're genetic manipulators. We'll get to them in just a moment, but the hypocrisy of continuing this eugenics program while condemning another group for doing the same thing is rather reminiscent of Cold War hypocrisy. And while the physical aspect of the project itself was a success, the psychological aspect of it was a complete bust. Think of Paul like Sentry, except he never listens to Val. He always remains in control of himself, and his void doesn't send people to the shadows, it sends him into the desert. That's right, in the second Dune book, Paul, after spending a few years as the Kwisatz Haderach and the cornerstone of a new religion, rejects his own powers and goes into the wastelands of Arrakis to atone for what he's unleashed on the universe. It's a tragic, terribly human tale of a man who gains power, gets corrupted by it, and is killed by it in the end. But at that point, the damage is irreversible. Paul's jihad kills billions across the known universe. It leads to his baby sister Aaliyah becoming an actual abomination, a fully awakened Bene Gesserit sister whose mind has been conquered by the other memory of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. All of the Kwisatz children had terrible fates, even the experimental ones that came before Paul, but his bloodline reshaped mankind and, in turn, destroyed them. Millennia of oppression was the gift that the Bene Gesserit's Kwisatz Haderach program gave to the universe, and by the time they learned their lesson, the hour was well past late. But at least the sisters had the good sense to cultivate their super being organically and patiently over the course of thousands of years. This ensured that whatever powers Paul would have would be completely natural and therefore without any faults. Artificially hastening this process could have had disastrous results, and that's something the Tleilaxu realized to their utter dismay. The Tleilaxu Breeding Program, Axolotl Tanks, and Kwisatz Haderach. The Bene Gesserit breeding program, as morally questionable as it is at least based on the premise of consent. No participant in it was mutilated or enslaved in the way we think of those terms. The women of Tleilax were not as fortunate, sadly, because they've been both mutilated and enslaved in ways we would have never imagined. The Tleilaxu are supposed to be diametric opposites of the Bene Gesserit. This sisterhood is an all-female organization. The Tleilaxu are an all-male species. The sisterhood practices eugenics on a personal level. The Tleilaxu practice it on a civilizational level. The sisterhood views genes as being a means to an end, but to the Tleilaxu, genes are the language of God, and so they've devoted their entire lives to researching and experimenting with them. No characters present in the Dune-verse are alien in nature, save perhaps the sandworms of Arrakis, but the Tleilaxu appear to be the most alien because they're the most genetically modified. They've transcended their human shell and become something more divine in their eyes and more sinister in the eyes of everyone else. Because the main feature of Tleilaxu society is that all of them are not born, but rather created within mystery machines called axolotl tanks. For the longest time, no one knew what an axolotl tank was. They figured it was highly advanced technology that flouted the Butlerian Jihad's tenets by merely existing, but was tolerated because it used biological material to facilitate its creations. Every person in Tleilaxu society, from the slave race of the face dancers to the highest Mashik, was created in an axolotl tank, so it stands to reason that they're using some sort of device to manufacture genetically perfect beings. It's revealed in the later Dune books that the Tleilaxu didn't create the axolotl tanks, they modified the one that nature had already perfected, aka the womb of a woman. The realization that axolotl tanks were mutilated women turned into breeding machines was a shocking one for the Bene Gesserit, and when they were put into a position where they had to ally with the Tleilaxu, their primary demand was that none of their sisters would ever become an axolotl tank. This shocks the Tleilaxu because not even members of their own race are supposed to know this secret, but the Bene Gesserit figure it out using a bit of classic deductive reasoning. They dress it up as mystical insight, of course, but the hints were always there. They'd never heard of a Tleilaxu female, and the axolotl tanks were their society's most closely guarded secret. After the death of the God Emperor Leto, humanity exploded across the universe, with several Bene Gesserit sisters and Tleilaxu masters escaping into the great unknown. When their ships met out there in the vastness of space, those sisters who defeated the Tleilaxu also liberated their axolotl tanks. It's horrifying to think that after centuries of serving as nothing more than a breeding vessel, a woman could even be liberated from it. That implies that they'd never been dead, and so all that genetic engineering lives in their conscious minds. These women merged with the sisters, who in turn morphed into the brutal honored matres, a race of women dedicated to completely dominating whoever got in their way. They enslaved men on a physical, mental, and emotional level, turning them into playthings the way the Tleilaxu turned their women into breeding slaves. And we don't know if that can be called justice, but it is sweet revenge for those poor women. And apart from the secret of the axolotl tanks, the Tleilaxu had another hidden up their sleeve, the Kwisatz Haderach program. Turns out, two societies can be as humanly different from one another as is possible, but if they pursue the same goals, they'll eventually get the same results. The Tleilaxu and the Bene Gesserit are two sides of the same coin, only the Tleilaxu aren't exactly masking their philosophy with the garb of moral decision-making. They are fully aware of the power a being like the Kwisatz can afford to whichever group controls it, and to them, imperial domination is their god's desire. The Tleilaxu make their move to capture the Imperium only after the Atreides family has given it millennia of violence and bloodshed because they're content with letting others spin their web of lies while they wait to strike from the shadows. You can find out more about this from our video on the entire history of the Tleilaxu, but the reason this is relevant to the video you're watching is because the Tleilaxu Kwisatz showed us what controlling a person's creation and eventual destiny would have looked like. The Tleilaxu don't use a 90-generation plan to collect genes carefully from several noble houses. they have the technology to fully recreate sentient organic beings from the cells of deceased people. These Golas, as they're known, are living proof that they can create whatever they so desire because they seem like reanimated dead men, but they are, in fact, alive and fully conscious of the fact that they are living beings created from the cells of another. The Tleilaxu used this concept to breed a super being whose DNA matrix was spliced with the genes of some of the most famous and innovative human beings from across history. This person was named Thallo, and because the Tleilaxu like insurance, they made about a half dozen more of him. From the moment Thallo was conscious, they'd been telling him that he was going to be the god of a new world, and training him to be the best at, well, everything. This is exactly what the Bene Gesserit would have done with Paul had he been born according to the plan, but the Tleilaxu program's final stage revealed the flaw in that assumption in gruesome fashion. All the conflicting messages and non-stop lessons had turned Thallo insane. He questioned why he listened to the masters if he was supposed to become God, because wasn't God all-powerful? And the weight of prescience was too much for him to bear. Thallo, like Paul, had visions of the past, present, and future, but because he didn't have a strong, fully formed personality, Thallo crumbled under the weight of his visions. He also blamed the Tleilaxu for making him this way, so he came up with a suicidal plan that would have taken them out along with him. The Tleilaxu got extremely lucky that one of their honored guests at the time was a former sister, and that her child had been specifically bred for assassination. Without the Fenrings on hand, Thallo would have likely succeeded, and while his existence is dubious in Frank Herbert's books, seeing as he was introduced by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson in Paul of Dune, we do know that the result would have been the same in the original books. In fact, it was, as in Dune Messiah, Scytale reveals that Tleilaxu had created a Kwisatz Haderach as well, and that he took his own life. Gaius Mohiam was shocked that the Tleilaxu had the same thought they had, and when they questioned Scytale about this, he simply answered that the Bene Gesserit never asked. This highlights the Tleilaxu policy of lying by omission. They're under no compulsion to give you the full story, and even if they are telling the truth when you hit upon the right mark, you can expect their words to be more confusing than truthful. But the reason we think that Scytale's Kwisatz could have realistically been Thallo is because he says this about the reason for his suicide. A creature who has spent his life creating one particular representation of his selfdom will die rather than become the antithesis of that representation. We know that this is true of Thallo because he believed himself to be God, thanks to his mental conditioning, but his reality was at odds with this because he was also aware that the Tleilaxu were truly his masters and that in the end, he was their creation. Either way, his personality was never developed enough for him to want to continue existing, so he killed himself. This, of course, isn't entirely true because the Tleilaxu were the ones who gave Thallo the representation of selfdom that led to his suicide. He very conveniently omits the fact that the Bene Tleilax used mental conditioning to make Thallo aware of his purpose, and that is where the true repulsive nature of their experiments is revealed. Even Scytale's participation in Dune Messiah isn't all about killing Paul, it has a secondary purpose, which was arguably more important to him. While he made it seem like the Tleilaxu had given up trying to create a Kwisatz Haderach Messiah, he was also the one closely related to ensuring that the Gola hate was successfully awakened. Hate had been created using the cells of Duncan Idaho, and unlike other Golas, he had the purpose of proving that immortality could be real, as twisted as that sounds. The Tleilaxu gambled that by exposing Hate to a situation where his mental conditioning conflicts with his core personality from his time as Duncan at an extreme level, that he'd break through the memory barrier most Golas are born with. That's exactly what happens when the Tleilaxu order him to kill Paul and his Atreides loyalty overrides the command. Hate gains full access to his memories as Duncan Idaho while retaining his experiences as Hate. The Tleilaxu use this breakthrough to immortalize their highest leaders, to whose ranks Scytale is promoted. The last couple of Dune books feature them the most, and every single high-ranking Tleilaxu we meet is a version of their original self from thousands of years prior. Scytale becomes the first to allow his flesh to be recreated as a Gola and then have his mind reawakened within the Gola. And thus do the Tleilaxu achieve genetic perfection. But the trauma it leaves within the minds of the Golas cannot be overstated. Duncan Idaho goes from being a revered warrior to a man whose history spans across space and time. And we wish that was a good thing, but it's not. Over thousands of years of genetic reproduction and manipulation, he eventually grows into an entity that's even more powerful than Paul or Leto Atreides II. Duncan is the final and ultimate Kwisatz Haderach of the series, and many fans don't like this because it was established by the Brian Herbert books. But the fact remains that even if Frank's desire was to end his saga differently, Duncan Idaho was always his endgame, so he was always going to become something akin to the ultimate Kwisatz. It's just beautiful that the Tleilaxu end up destroying themselves while trying to control this super being centuries after the Bene Gesserit learned their lesson, because it highlights a key aspect of human nature. No matter how many times we learn that meddling with certain powers should be off limits, we're not content with what we know, and our thirst for knowledge has pushed us to do terrible things. Doctors today are lifesavers, but if they pulled up with their medical gear to a medieval tavern, they'd likely be lynched for being serial killers or necromancers. Surgical advancement has a dark past, no one denies it, and yet that past was necessary for it to reach the place it has today. The Tleilaxu had a similar philosophy, it seems, and yet they weren't content with mere progress. Their philosophy on genetics and conquest was all pervasive, which is why they ended up being annihilated by the descendants of the very women they had used as tanks centuries prior. The Tleilaxu breeding program was worse than the Bene Gesserit breeding program because instead of stopping at failure, they devised newer ways to keep chipping away at the same eugenic problem. But the end result was the same. They couldn't control it, and it destroyed them in turn. Leto II's breeding program. Now, one of the more interesting breeding programs from the Dune series comes from the halls of the God Emperor himself, when Leto II allowed sand trout to attach themselves to his body and transform him on a molecular level. He gained prescience unlike any individual had before or after him. Leto could travel through the mists of time at the drop of a hat, and his ego was regulated by a council he'd created within himself, over which he reigned supreme. Leto was the perfect Kwisatz Haderach because not only could he control his prescience, he didn't succumb to it like his father did, and thus he was able to achieve the true golden path. Prescience, Leto realized, is a genetic problem. As long as humans keep seeking substances and experiences that link their minds to the fabric of space-time, they will never be free from the yoke of destiny. Humanity will always seek to use prescience as a means to conquer or subjugate other peoples, and in the end, prescience will be turned against them. Leto, being the only perfect viewer of prescient visions, had seen the future where all humans would go extinct. In his mind's eye, it was the Ixians who would devise a hunter-seeker so effective it never failed to find and kill its target. These hunter-seekers would be bestowed with the power of prescience as well, and would eventually come to kill all living humans, including their creators. To prevent this future from taking hold, Leto needed to breed prescience out of humanity, and that's where his breeding program came in. He took over the Sisterhood's line of generational eugenics and started breeding a chosen one of his own, but his goal was the opposite of the Sisterhood's. Leto was looking to create the No gene, a strand of DNA that could hide its owner from all kinds of prescience. The concept would be similar to an Ixian no ship or no room, which works on that same basic principle. The Ixians developed a particular kind of technology that was able to hide whatever was housed within it from Leto's prescience. This is how they trapped him with Huinori, because he never saw her coming, literally. Leto had perfected prescience, and yet he couldn't predict what Hui was until the moment he saw her, and the moment he saw her, he fell in love with her. Leto wanted to breed this trait into humanity itself, because to him, prescience, not the machines or the Ixians, was the greatest existential threat. Leto often spends his nights roaming through his other memory, reliving the days when humans were lively and full of purpose, because the spice had done away with all of that. It had created a universe dependent on it for longevity and prescient powers, which in turn inspired Leto's golden plan. The God Emperor kept humans in a forced state of technological and psychological stagnation for over 3.5 millennia while he bred the No gene. During this time, he went from tyrant to god to tyrant once again in their minds, and in later epics, Leto would even be remembered as a prophet. But the thing that makes his breeding program abhorrent is the fact that he used members of his own family and countless Idaho Golas to finally achieve the No gene. For some reason, Leto II kept the Tleilaxu bound to his will by constantly making them send him Duncan Idaho Golas. These Golas mostly turn against Leto after witnessing the full extent of his atrocities, and only a handful have been able to grasp his longer vision for the future. But is that vision even truthful? Leto II's breeding of the No gene prevented the Ixians from creating Arafel, but it only shifted that responsibility onto the shoulders of other beings. In Frank's original vision for the series, those would be the enhanced face dancers Marty and Daniel. And in Brian Herbert's conclusion, it was the return of the thinking machines, which, while conceptually similar to the Ixian ending, is a completely different story if you know anything about the Dune-verse. Leto II's great hope, Siona Atreides, the woman whom prescience couldn't find, ended up withering after his demise. We aren't told much about her future after Leto's passing, only that she escaped with the latest Duncan, Idaho, and started a colony of her own. And seeing as she was in love with Duncan, it's more than likely they had kids. The final set of Frank Herbert's Dune novels are set about a millennium and a half after God Emperor of Dune, which is enough time for the No gene to spread to many humans, but not all. And after the honored Matre invasion and Frank Herbert's premature death, there's no telling what this No gene's purpose was going to be in the endgame. Much of Leto II's reign was also rendered pointless because he'd hoped that his tyranny would inspire humans to never organize themselves behind one leader or one god. But the Tleilaxu made him their god's prophet based on ancient similarities between their faith and that of the Zen-Sunni wanderers who became Fremen. So, Leto's message didn't spread in the way he meant for it to spread, and Siona's creation was sort of pointless. That's not to mention the fact that all his Duncans probably knew they were being used to breed the No gene. At the very least, his last Duncan certainly knew. So now imagine using your ideological enemy to breed your ideological goal and not being able to quite fulfill either. Prescience takes something of a back seat in the final two Dune novels, which deal with the Matre invasion extensively. So what is the point of Leto's breeding program? It was hope, but that hope was besmirched by the cruel winds of fate and time, and now we'll never know. But what we do know is what the Bene Gesserit did after the God Emperor's death. The second Bene Gesserit breeding program. The Bene Gesserit reclaimed their lost genes and continued their breeding program, albeit with different hopes this time around. They no longer wished to create the Kwisatz Haderach, but they did keep experimenting on Duncan, Idaho Golas and breeding individuals with unique capabilities. They stopped trying to create Paul's specific DNA matrix again, but they also kept targeting unique genes within the Old Imperium, which led to the creation of two of the most important final novel Dune characters. The first is Shiana, a Fremen woman born on Arrakis after Leto II's death. Shiana is descended from Siona, so she should have the No gene, but she also displays this extremely curious ability to control sandworms with her mind. Shiana becomes the linchpin for the Bene Gesserit plan to finally monopolize sandworms, as she's the only one that can ensure that a worm survives its journey from Arrakis to the secret Sisterhood homeworld. Once the transport is successful, Shiana basically creates a second Dune by assisting with the sandworm life cycle, and if the novels ended the way Herbert wanted them to, Shiana would have likely become the savior of mankind. The other notable product of this program was Miles Tegg, another Atreides descendant who possessed prescience in its most unique form. Miles Tegg had been trained to become a Bashar for the Sisterhood for centuries. He'd been given the Duncan, Idaho treatment, but his conditioning went one step further. Miles was regularly subjected to Ixian probing devices which were said to bore into the minds of their targets and lay all their thoughts out in the open. The Miles Tegg that is important to our video had been trained to resist these devices for a long time, but when he was subjected to another device of the same make but with an even more intense effect, something changed within his mind. Miles became capable of teleportation as he escaped his bonds, killed his captors, and made his way back to the Sisterhood. He was also able to foresee specific events that seemed to be correlated to human survival in the long run. Miles Tegg was basically granted the unique ability to move ahead to the prescient vision he's had, which can be summed up by saying he phases in and out of existence. This would be an exceptional mutation of the No gene because, in a way, now humans can move ahead on paths that allow them to live and thrive. Once again, it's a damn shame that instead of fully exploring the possibilities of these two genetic anomalies, the Brian Herbert books reverted to a known enemy. Heck, they even created their own prehistoric breeding program with the Titans, a race of humans who had their brains implanted within supermachines. The Titan Agamemnon used his biological material to create a series of sons, but all of them failed to live up to his standards, until Vorian Atreides was born, the progenitor of House Atreides. We're not dedicating a section to this simply because we don't think it's worth the investment. The Titans were a caricature of what we think the AI apocalypse will look like, and Vorian ended up siding with humans irrespective of his father's control. In that regard, his descendants take after him, but that's about all that's noteworthy about the Titan breeding program. We guess we could also talk about the fact that the Brian Herbert conclusion to the series involves a couple of Golas affiliated with the thinking machines, those being Vladimir Harkonnen and Paulo, an alternate version of the original Kwisatz, Paul Atreides. At this point in the story, the thinking machines had been revealed as the masters of the enhanced face dancers. Daniel and Marty were portrayed as the reincarnations of Omnius and Erasmus, and Gola, Baron Harkonnen, and Paul Atreides were created with the specific purpose of beating the humans to the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach. In the end, none of it mattered because the material they used to unlock Paulo's prescience was just too strong and volatile, and Erasmus betrayed the thinking machines to join with the final Duncan's consciousness. No, the second Bene Gesserit attempt at controlling the narrative of the world is more worthy of a mention because it highlights the same problems that the Tleilaxu have. The sisters learn that they shouldn't make another Kwisatz Haderach, but they never give up on eugenics itself. They keep furthering the tradition of crossing DNA with DNA to produce individuals with a unique place in the universe, and time and again they're double-crossed, betrayed, or they simply fail. All this is to say that the humans of Dune might be able to engineer the perfect biological specimen, but they can never control a man's mind, because that's the only free part of him. They can influence it, subjugate it, even brutalize it. But all slaves dream of freedom, and even the ones that put their shackles on willingly are subject to unspeakable horrors because of how they're viewed. Every breeding program in the Dune series is an inherent criticism of humanity's obsession with playing God, and that's why we decided to dive deep into the subject with this video. Having said that, we hope you enjoyed it because marvelous verdict. That's all we've got for you guys today. Let us know which breeding program from Dune makes you want to throw up more than the rest down in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more awesome videos like this one. We'll see you guys soon, so until then, stay safe and don't believe a word that comes out of the mouth of a Bene Gesserit, or anyone else from Dune for that matter.